The headlines have moved on. Maduro is in New York. The airstrikes are over. The press conferences are done. But what happened in Venezuela between January 2nd and 4th, 2026 is not a story about one arrest or one leader's removal. It's a story about systems, about how hemispheric control operates when economic pressure gives way to military force, and what that reveals about the architecture of power in the Western Hemisphere. This analysis examines what actually happened, not through the framing of democracy versus authoritarianism that dominated the headlines, but through the mechanics of resource competition, currency systems, and great power positioning that made military intervention not just possible, but from Washington's perspective, necessary. For over 2 decades, the strategic landscape of Latin America has been quietly transforming. The change wasn't dramatic, it was incremental. Ports built in Peru and Brazil, infrastructure loans from Beijing, free trade agreements that bypassed Washington entirely. And at the center of this transformation sat Venezuela, 300 billion barrels of oil, the world's largest proven reserves, increasingly integrated into Chinese economic planning rather than American control. Let me show you what this operation reveals about power when diplomacy fails and force becomes policy. The Maduro government has been under American sanctions since 2017. For 7 years, Washington applied economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and support for opposition movements. None of it worked. Maduro remained in power. Venezuelan oil continued flowing to China, and Beijing's economic footprint in South America kept expanding. So why did military intervention happen in January 2026, not 2023 or 2024? 3 factors converged to create the operational window. First, Russia's commitment to Ukraine. Moscow has been Venezuela's primary military backer for decades. Russian advisors trained Venezuelan forces. Russian weapons equipped their military. Russian diplomatic support protected Maduro at the UN. But Russia's resources are now fully absorbed in Ukraine. Their capacity to project power into the Western Hemisphere has effectively disappeared. The protection Russia once provided simply doesn't exist anymore. Second, China's calculated restraint. Beijing has $60 billion invested in Venezuelan energy infrastructure and owes roughly $18 billion in Venezuelan debt. But China's strategic assessment concluded that Venezuelan oil wasn't worth direct military confrontation with the United States. China's response to the operation was diplomatic protest and economic countermeasures, not military threats. Beijing recognized the hemispheric reality. The Americas remain territory where US military superiority is overwhelming and geographic proximity makes intervention low risk for Washington. Third, domestic political calculation in the United States. Trump's second-term emphasis on the Monroe Doctrine created political cover for action that would have been controversial in previous administrations. The framing of hemispheric security against Chinese economic penetration resonated with both political parties. And the operation's swift success, Maduro captured within 72 hours, minimal American casualties, validated the decision before domestic opposition could organize. These 3 factors created a moment where military intervention became operationally feasible and politically sustainable. The question isn't why it happened. The question is what it reveals about how power operates when diplomatic constraints disappear. Here's what most coverage misses about Venezuelan oil. The strategic value isn't current production. Venezuela's output has collapsed from over 3 million barrels per day in the 1990s to less than 1 million today. Infrastructure has decayed. Skilled workers have fled. The petroleum sector is a shadow of its former capacity, but that misses the point entirely. Venezuela's strategic value is future control over 300 billion barrels of proven reserves. That's larger than Saudi Arabia's reserves. It represents roughly 18% of global petroleum resources, and under Maduro those reserves were being integrated into Chinese economic planning through deals that priced oil outside the dollar system. This is where denomination becomes more important than volume. For 50 years, global oil has been priced in US dollars. This system creates automatic demand for American currency. Every country that needs oil needs dollars to purchase it. That demand allows the United States to borrow at lower interest rates, run larger deficits, and print money without immediate inflation consequences that would destroy any other economy. But that system is fracturing. Saudi Arabia has refused to renew exclusive dollar arrangements. BRICS nations are increasingly settling energy trades in local currencies or yuan. And Venezuela, according to multiple intelligence assessments, was preparing to fully integrate its energy sector into China's cross-border interbank payment system and price oil in a basket of currencies led by yuan. If that had succeeded, it would have proven that major oil exporters could price energy outside the dollar system and survive. That precedent would have accelerated the dollar's decline as the dominant reserve currency, not immediately, not catastrophically, but structurally over decades. This is why the Trump administration moved when it did. The operation wasn't about removing Maduro because he's authoritarian. It was about preventing Venezuela's 300 billion barrels from becoming the proof of concept that dollar-based energy pricing is optional. Trump said this explicitly in his January 4th press conference, though it was quickly walked back by State Department officials. He said American oil companies would go in, rebuild the infrastructure, and extract wealth. He said the oil would go to other countries and to the United States as, quote, reimbursement for damages. That language was cleaned up within 24 hours. Rubio went on television to say this was about governance, not resources, but the contradiction tells you everything. Trump describes what the operation accomplishes. Rubio manages the diplomatic fallout. The reality sits somewhere between. To understand why Venezuela triggered military intervention, you need to understand what's been happening across Latin America for 2 decades. China-Latin America trade hit $518 billion in 2024. That's not a rounding error. That's over $500 billion in commerce. 20 years ago, China accounted for less than 2% of Latin American exports. Today, China is South America's largest trading partner. Brazil trades more with China than with the United States. So does Peru. So does Chile. But trade volume is just the surface. The strategic transformation is infrastructure. China now owns or operates major ports in Peru, Brazil, Panama, and Ecuador. The port of Shanxi in Peru, which became operational in late 2025, is designed to handle exports from 6 South American countries directly to Asia. It cuts the United States out of the supply chain entirely. Brazilian soybeans, Chilean copper, Peruvian minerals, all flowing to China through Chinese-controlled infrastructure. 22 out of 33 Latin American and Caribbean nations have joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. That's not just trade agreements. That's ports, railroads, energy contracts, and payment systems that operate independently of Western financial architecture. Venezuela was becoming the energy anchor for this system. Chinese companies secured exclusive access to 70% of Venezuela's oil reserves through deals negotiated during the Maduro years. Not current production, future reserves that won't be fully exploited for decades. China was locking up energy supplies for the next half-century, while American companies remained shut out by sanctions Washington imposed. This is the context that made intervention strategically necessary from Washington's perspective. The United States was watching its historical sphere of influence shift economically toward Beijing through infrastructure that couldn't be reversed through sanctions or diplomatic pressure. And Venezuela represented the energy component that would make China's South American presence sustainable long-term. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's portfolio is Latin America. That's his focus, that's his expertise, and his strategic goal is clear: reassert American economic leverage in the hemisphere through force when economic pressure fails. The Venezuela operation is the signal. It says if you move too far toward China, if you threaten dollar-based energy pricing, if you become a critical node in Beijing's supply chain, there are consequences. This isn't regime change in the traditional democracy promotion sense. This is market rebalancing through military force. Here's the question that should dominate analysis but doesn't. Who governs Venezuela now? Trump said the United States would, quote, run the country. Rubio said no. Existing structures would handle day-to-day governance. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez appeared on state television claiming she remains in charge. Opposition leader Maria Corina Machado says Edmundo Gonzalez should assume the presidency under constitutional succession. There's no clarity, and that's a massive problem because governance isn't speeches. It's enforcement, it's who signs contracts, who collects revenue, who controls security forces, who guarantees legal frameworks for investment. Right now, nobody has clear answers. Oil companies won't invest billions without knowing who they're negotiating with. International banks won't clear payments without legal clarity about governmental authority. Shipping companies won't move cargo without insurance guarantees that require recognised governmental structures. This creates three possible paths forward. Path 1, controlled transition. The United States brokers, a deal between remnants of the existing government and opposition forces. A transitional authority is established with international recognition. Oil contracts are renegotiated. Revenue flows are restructured toward debt payment and infrastructure rebuilding. This is the best case scenario. It requires cooperation from multiple factions, none of whom trust each other, and years of institution building. Path 2, fragmentation. The government fractures into regional power centres, some areas controlled by military units loyal to elements of the old regime, others by opposition groups, others by criminal networks that filled the vacuum. Oil production stays disrupted because nobody can guarantee security across the full production chain. Investment doesn't happen. The humanitarian crisis worsens. This is the Iraq-Libya scenario where military intervention succeeds tactically but creates governance chaos that lasts decades. Path 3, economic counterpressure. China doesn't accept the outcome. Beijing continues buying Venezuelan oil through shadow tankers and obscure financial channels. China provides economic support to resistance elements. Beijing uses its leverage in other Latin American countries to isolate US-backed governance structures. Venezuela becomes a long-term economic battleground where American military control doesn't translate into economic control. This is the great power competition scenario. None of these paths are clean, none resolve quickly, and the Trump administration hasn't articulated which one they're pursuing or how they plan to navigate the complexity. This is high-stakes economic manoeuvring without a clear endgame, and that's dangerous because the easy part, removing a government, is done. The hard part, building a functioning state that serves American strategic interests, hasn't started. The most revealing aspect of the Venezuela operation is what didn't happen. The international response was muted, diplomatic protests from expected sources, but no coordinated resistance, no emergency UN Security Council sessions that mattered, no concrete actions that changed operational realities on the ground. This tells you something important about how power is perceived globally. European governments issued statements expressing, quote, grave concern while doing nothing to complicate the operation. European banks were told to scrutinize Venezuelan transactions and freeze assets linked to the Maduro government. This creates financial choke points that go beyond military action. And if you can't clear payments through the European banks, you can't settle international contracts. If your assets are frozen in London or Frankfurt, you lose liquidity for operations. This is how modern economic warfare works. The United States provides military pressure. Europe provides financial isolation. Together they create a system where resistance becomes economically unsustainable regardless of military outcomes. Latin American nations faced impossible calculations. Publicly opposing the operation risks American retaliation through tariffs, aid cuts, or diplomatic isolation. Publicly supporting it risks domestic political backlash and association with imperialism. Most chose tactical silence, expressing concern about international law while avoiding concrete actions that would force confrontation with Washington. Brazil, under President Lula, issued the strongest opposition statements, but took no actions that would actually complicate American operations. Colombian President Petro condemned the intervention, but didn't close Colombian airspace or ports to American military logistics. Mexico expressed concern while maintaining normal diplomatic relations. The regional message is clear: we don't like this, but we won't risk our relationship with the United States to stop it. China's response was calibrated and restrained. Beijing issued strong diplomatic condemnation. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi called the operation, quote, unacceptable violation of sovereignty, and demanded, quote, immediate restoration of legitimate government. But China didn't threaten military response or economic retaliation that would trigger broader confrontation. This reveals China's strategic assessment. Venezuelan oil wasn't worth direct confrontation with American military power in the Western Hemisphere. Beijing will write off the $60 billion invested in Venezuela as the cost of learning that economic partnerships in the Americas remain vulnerable to American military intervention, regardless of international law or commercial agreements. Russia's response was even more muted, because Russia simply lacks capacity to project power into South America while fully committed in Ukraine. Moscow issued perfunctory statements, but everyone understands Russia's protection is no longer operative. The collective international response demonstrates that American military dominance in the Western Hemisphere remains unchallenged. Economic integration with China doesn't provide security against American military action. Belt and road infrastructure doesn't come with Chinese military protection, and international law doesn't constrain powerful nations when they decide their strategic interests require intervention. Here's the connection most analysis misses. These aren't separate conversations. They are linked by a single strategic logic. Consolidating control over Western Hemisphere resources and infrastructure before great power competition escalates further. Consider the pattern that emerged in Trump's first weeks back in office. Pressure on Canada over trade and border security. Trump threatened tariffs and questioned the viability of current bilateral arrangements. The message, Canadian sovereignty over resources and trade policy, isn't absolute when American strategic interests are involved. Renewed focus on Greenland's mineral resources. Trump discussed purchasing Greenland or securing access to rare earth minerals and strategic positioning. The framing was economic, but the substance was about ensuring Chinese companies don't gain control over resources the United States considers strategically essential. Rhetoric about Panama Canal control and the security of critical shipping infrastructure. Trump questioned whether current arrangements adequately protect American interests. The message, trade routes and infrastructure in the Americas operate under American oversight whether formal treaties acknowledge it or not. And now, military intervention in Venezuela. These moves share common logic. Secure the backyard, control critical supply lines, deny adversaries access to resources and infrastructure in the Western Hemisphere. Before you engage in great power competition with China, you consolidate your region. This isn't new strategy. It's the Monroe Doctrine adapted to 21st century great power competition. In 1823, President Monroe declared that European powers attempting to colonize or interfere in the Americas would be viewed as acts of aggression requiring US response. The doctrine worked because American military power in the Hemisphere was overwhelming, and European powers calculated that Western Hemisphere ventures weren't worth war with the United States. Trump's version updates the doctrine for Chinese economic penetration rather than European colonial ambitions. The message to Beijing is identical. The Americas are our sphere of influence. Your economic presence will be tolerated within limits. But when your infrastructure and financial systems threaten to replace American dominance, military force becomes an option. The Venezuela operation demonstrates that this isn't empty rhetoric. When economic pressure fails and Chinese integration proceeds anyway, Washington is prepared to use military force to reset the equation. The immediate market reaction to the Venezuela operation was surprisingly muted. Oil prices spiked briefly, then stabilized. Energy stocks gained slightly on expectations of eventual access to Venezuelan reserves. Bond markets absorbed the news without major disruption. This calm tells you something important. Markets are pricing into optimistic scenarios that might not materialize. The optimistic scenario assumes Venezuelan oil production returns to 3 million barrels per day over the next decade through American company investment in infrastructure rebuilding. That would add significant supply to global markets. Heavy crude, suitable for Gulf Coast refineries, priced in dollars under American company control. But that scenario requires political stability and governance clarity that doesn't exist. Rebuilding Venezuelan oil infrastructure will take years and tens of billions of dollars. It requires security that allows foreign workers to operate safely. It requires legal frameworks that give companies confidence their investments won't be seized or challenged. It requires governmental authority that can sign contracts and guarantee their enforcement. None of that exists right now. The more realistic scenario involves years of governance chaos, disrupted production, and competing claims to authority that prevent major investment. In this scenario, Venezuelan oil output stays suppressed, contributing nothing to global supply. The operation achieves its negative goal, preventing Chinese control, but doesn't achieve the positive goal of bringing reserves back under American company production. This matters because financial markets are pricing in the optimistic scenario, while operational realities suggest something much more difficult. When that gap becomes apparent, there will be corrections. Energy stocks that gained on Venezuela expectations will give back gains. Oil prices will adjust upward as it becomes clear that Venezuelan supply isn't coming back quickly. For consumers, this means the promised relief at the gas pump probably won't materialize. Retail fuel prices lag crude markets by weeks or months, and the impact of Venezuela will be minimal in the near term. The psychological impact might be larger than the economic one. The perception of energy security and American control over hemispheric resources, creating political benefits even when actual price changes are small. For the global energy market, the bigger implication is about precedent. If the United States can use military force to reset resource control when economic partnerships favor adversaries, what does that mean for other energy exporters? Do trade agreements and contracts mean anything when military force can overwrite them? These are questions that will reshape investment decisions and risk calculations across the energy sector for years. Let me bring this back to what matters for understanding the bigger picture. The Venezuela operation wasn't about Maduro. It was about preventing 300 billion barrels of oil from becoming fully integrated into Chinese economic planning outside dollar-denominated systems. It was about reasserting control over Western Hemisphere resources before Chinese infrastructure made that control irreversible through economic facts on the ground. Greenland, Panama, Canada, Venezuela, they're all connected. They're all part of strategic consolidation of hemispheric resources and trade routes. The Trump administration calls this national security. Critics call it imperialism. but the economic logic is consistent. Secure supply lines, control pricing mechanisms, deny competitors access. Whether this strategy succeeds depends on variables nobody can predict. Can Venezuela be stabilized? Will oil companies actually invest billions in a country with no clear governance? How will China respond over the long term? Can the United States maintain legitimacy in Latin America while using military force to override sovereignty? History suggests caution. Iraq was supposed to stabilize quickly and become a reliable oil supplier. It didn't. Libya was supposed to transition to functional governance. It became a failed state. Afghanistan was supposed to demonstrate that American-backed governments could provide security and development. 2 decades later, the Taliban control the country again. Removing governments is tactically easy when you have overwhelming military superiority. Building functioning states that serve your strategic interests is extraordinarily difficult, and there's no indication that the Trump administration has a plan for the hard part. The question that should dominate analysis is what happens if this doesn't work? What happens if Venezuela fragments? If oil production stays disrupted for years? If China doubles down on alternative supply chains and other Latin American nations decide that partnership with the United States is too risky because sovereignty becomes conditional on alignment? Those questions will determine whether the Venezuela operation was a strategic success or an expensive demonstration that military dominance doesn't automatically translate into economic control. And right now, we're too early in the process to know the answer. What we can say with confidence is this: the economic contest for South America is no longer background noise. It's front and center. The stakes are oil, dollars, and the architecture of hemispheric power. And the United States just demonstrated that when economic pressure fails to achieve strategic objectives, military force becomes policy. That's the story, not the arrest, not the press conferences, the reshaping of how power operates in the Western Hemisphere, when great power competition eliminates the diplomatic space that previously prevented military solutions. The headlines have moved on, but the consequences are just beginning.